faithfully convey value and explore great books worldwide. Hi, this is Sally's Book Talk. Last episode, I covered the third volume of The Glory and the Dream. Today, I'll cover the fourth volume. Before we start, let's briefly recap the last episode. Last time, I discussed American history from 1951 to 1960. During that decade, McCarthyism peaked, but thankfully, it was exposed by insightful people, leading to McCarthy's downfall. After that, the U.S. economy boomed, living standards soared, and American values were exported forcefully as national power grew, making Americans proud. But beneath the glory, there were shadows. The escalating U.S.-Soviet rivalry and the rise of the civil rights movement worried Americans. Next, we dive into the fourth volume of The Glory and the Dream, the final book. It narrates American history from 1961 to 1972, a turbulent period. In just 10 years, 3 presidents served: Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon. This turnover rate is rare in U.S. history, and 2 left office abnormally. First, let's discuss the Kennedy era. Kennedy took office in early 1961 and was assassinated in November 1963, serving just over 2 years. No brief, his impact was immense, and his personal life alone holds many stories. You could say Kennedy hailed from a wealthy family. His father was a financier and entrepreneur with vast connections in finance and politics. So, from his political debut, Kennedy sailed smoothly, and with his good looks, he was adored by female voters. Kennedy's private life was also a hot topic of gossip. It's rumored Kennedy had hundreds of mistresses, and his affair with sex symbol Marilyn Monroe was widely sensationalized. Of course, Kennedy's lasting legacy in history isn't built on gossip. His outstanding achievements in foreign affairs and domestic policy are why Americans remember him fondly. So, what key initiatives did Kennedy introduce? Now, I'll elaborate on that. There are 2 main aspects. One is handling the escalating U.S.-Soviet rivalry, and the other is supporting the civil rights movement. First, let's cover the U.S.-Soviet rivalry escalation. As mentioned before, in 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite in human history, shocking America. To catch up, the Eisenhower administration announced launching a satellite, but the rocket crashed, turning into a joke. In the first round of the space race, the U.S. lagged behind the Soviet Union. After Kennedy took office, the situation became even more intense. On April 12, 1961, the Soviet Union launched a manned spacecraft that orbited Earth, making cosmonaut Gagarin the first human in space. Clearly, the Soviets had taken the lead again. Kennedy couldn't sit still. After all, he'd only been in office for 3 months, and the Soviets gave him such a gift, embarrassing him. That night at 7, Kennedy convened a cabinet meeting to discuss countermeasures. His advisors told him that to outshine the Soviets, they had to take a bold step by landing on the moon. But it would cost a fortune, up to $40 billion. Kennedy thought it was too expensive, and Congress wouldn't agree. But the advisors said that Americans showing face on the moon would have an impact no other plan could match. Kennedy gritted his teeth and said he'd convince Congress. This was the origin of the Apollo program. On May 25th, Kennedy delivered a special address to Congress, framing the Apollo program as a national emergency, crucial for the U.S. to defeat the Soviet Union and win the Cold War. So, investing any amount of money was worth it. Amidst the intense Cold War atmosphere, Congress overwhelmingly approved the proposal, officially launching the Apollo program. From 1961 to 1969, Americans spent over 8 years going through 3 presidents to finally send Apollo 11 to the moon, which remains the only human landing on another celestial body to date. This not only caused a huge sensation at the time, but remains a fascinating topic today. This move allowed the U.S. to overpower the Soviet Union in the space race. While the US and USSR were competing in space, they didn't neglect matters on Earth. Among them, worth mentioning is the construction of the Berlin Wall. After World War II, Germany was divided into East Germany and West Germany, and Berlin was split into two, East Berlin and West Berlin. Due to West Germany's prosperous economy and high living standards, since the 1950s, East Germans flocked to West Germany, putting great pressure on East Germany and the Soviet Union. The Soviet government repeatedly demanded that West Germany stop this, but it had little effect. In June 1961, Kennedy and Khrushchev met in Vienna to discuss the Berlin issue, where Khrushchev brought it up again but was refused. Seeing the Americans wouldn't yield to either soft or hard tactics, the Soviets simply built the Berlin Wall along the east-west Berlin border in just 4 days. This 155-kilometer wall isolated East Germany. You could say the Berlin Wall was the most iconic symbol of the Cold War. Its construction marked the peak of the Cold War, and 40 years later, its demolition signaled the Cold War's end. After the Berlin Wall was built, the focus of U.S.-Soviet rivalry shifted to Cuba. Cuba is located in the Caribbean Sea, separated from Florida by just a strait, giving it significant strategic value to the U.S. Traditionally viewed by Americans as their backyard, in early 1959, Cuban communists launched an uprising, overthrowing the dictatorship and establishing a revolutionary government. This made the Kennedy administration very nervous. Actually, Cuba didn't want to oppose the U.S. After all, the Soviet Union was far away, while the U.S. was right at its doorstep. What good would antagonizing them bring? But the U.S. government overreacted, arming Cuban exiles abroad. They landed at the Bay of Pigs on Cuba's southwest coast, attempting to overthrow the revolutionary government. This was the Bay of Pigs incident. The Bay of Pigs incident ended in U.S. failure, leaving Kennedy humiliated. Even worse, Cuba then fully aligned with the Soviet Union. So, in international politics, enemies aren't necessarily self-created. They're often created by foolish foreign policies. The Soviets provided Cuba with massive equipment, including dozens of nuclear warheads, each 10 to 20 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. In October 1962, the U.S. Air Force discovered this and reported to the White House. Kennedy was shocked, addressed the world via radio, announced a blockade of Cuba, and demanded the Soviets remove all offensive weapons. Soviet leader Khrushchev responded they wouldn't back down. Kennedy immediately dispatched a fleet to surround Cuba. U.S. missile forces were on high alert, with nuclear warheads ready at any moment. This was the Cuban Missile Crisis, with U.S. and Soviet nuclear arsenals capable of destroying Earth multiple times over. Nations were tense and engaged in diplomatic mediation. Ultimately, Khrushchev compromised, and the Soviets withdrew the missiles. Declassified documents show Kennedy was determined if the Soviets didn't yield, the U.S. would attack, even using nuclear weapons. This was humanity's closest brush with nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis profoundly impacted the global landscape. Both the U.S. and Soviet Union realized that while competition was fine, they shouldn't touch nuclear weapons. A real war would be catastrophic. From 1963 to 1972, the U.S. and USSR signed a series of treaties limiting nuclear weapon use and proliferation, forming the basic framework of the International Non-Proliferation System. To this day, dozens of countries, including the US, UK, China, France, and Russia, have signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. To recap briefly, since taking office in early 1961, in under 2 years, Kennedy experienced launching the Apollo program, the Berlin Wall construction, and the Cuban Missile Crisis. His diplomatic maneuvers were dizzyingly frequent. Now, I'll cover the second aspect, the Black Civil Rights Movement. Starting in the mid-1950s, American Black people's rights awareness awakened. sparking the civil rights movement. The 1957 Little Rock incident established Black students' right to enter public schools and receive education alongside white students. During Kennedy's era, under Martin Luther King Jr.'s leadership, the Black civil rights movement surged further. Who exactly was Martin Luther King Jr.? Born in January 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, he became a pastor at 17. Martin Luther King Jr. was exceptionally bright and studious from childhood, excelling academically and eventually earning a doctorate. By all accounts, a social elite, but in his Georgia, racial discrimination was severe. Black people often faced injustice, and King personally suffered, so he joined the civil rights movement early. During his involvement, King realized anti-Black discrimination had deep roots in America. Accumulated resentment between whites and Blacks made the movement prone to extremism, even bloodshed. But this wasn't what King wanted. How to avoid it? He recalled Mahatma Gandhi, how Gandhi's nonviolent resistance forced Britain to grant Indian independence. This greatly inspired King. He decided to target bus segregation as his starting point, launching the bus boycott movement. In late 1955, King arrived in Montgomery, calling on all Black residents to boycott buses until segregation was abolished. Ultimately, a federal district court ruled bus segregation unconstitutional. With this initial victory, King gained confidence and organized sit-in protests. The specific approach was Black people would go to establishments that refused to serve them. Whether restaurants or bars, they deliberately sit down and demand service. And when refused, they wouldn't leave until owners called police who jailed them. This was exactly the effect Martin Luther King Jr. wanted. More arrests meant more attention. He famously declared, "Fill the jails to achieve equality." This sit-in movement infuriated racists. They abused and beat Black protesters, while white police not only failed to intervene but assisted them. Inspired by King, Black people showed remarkable restraint, enduring insults and violence without retaliation, making clear who was barbaric and who was civilized. Public opinion gradually shifted with growing sympathy for Black people. As the book's author notes, nonviolent resistance awakened white Americans' conscience, especially students who embraced King's message and joined sit-ins. From this point, the civil rights movement was no longer just a Black struggle. It evolved into a broad social movement, with King emerging as its leader through immense prestige. His next target was the nation's capital, Washington. In August 1963, King organized about 250,000 people for the March on Washington to demand civil rights for Black Americans. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, he delivered his famous speech, "I have a dream." King traced the arduous efforts since Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation to eliminate racial discrimination and secure civil rights. He declared his dream that one day, the Declaration's words, "all men are created equal," would be realized in America, with all races, white and Black, living in harmony together. The "I Have a Dream" speech marked the peak of the Black civil rights movement. It's hailed as one of the greatest speeches of the 20th century, still stirring emotions today. What was Kennedy's stance on the Black civil rights movement? Simply put, Kennedy supported it and consistently focused on Black issues. The day before his presidential inauguration, discovering no Black soldiers in the Coast Guard, he immediately ordered an investigation. As the movement reached its climax, Kennedy told Americans that Black circumstances were worse than imagined. Half couldn't attend high school, and even college graduates had only half the employment rate of whites. Black people generally earned lower wages than whites, with an average lifespan 7 years shorter. The night after Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech, he was received by Kennedy. Kennedy told him, "I have a dream too, and my dream is your dream." It should be said that Kennedy advanced the Black Civil Rights Movement and laid the groundwork for the Civil Rights Act. But he never lived to see it. On November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy was assassinated, just 3 months after meeting King. Kennedy's death remains one of the most infamous assassinations in U.S. history, with the truth still elusive. Some claimed racists killed him, others pointed to the mafia, and some even suspected Vice President Lyndon Johnson, all now considered basely speculation. Yet Johnson did benefit from Kennedy's death, as the U.S. Constitution mandates the vice president succeeds the president, making Johnson the 36th president. Johnson's early presidency can be summarized in 6 words. Time was tight, the task heavy. What does that mean? Simply put, a new election was imminent after he took office. Poor performance could limit his presidency to just that year. So for him, achieving results and pleasing voters were urgent priorities. Early in his term, Johnson launched major initiatives, all motivated by winning the election. So what exactly did Johnson do? Specifically, he outlined a blueprint called the Great Society Program. This blueprint first included massive tax cuts to ease corporate burdens. Second was declaring war on poverty, aiding poor families, providing vocational training for dropouts, and expanding free healthcare to protect vulnerable groups' medical rights. These measures won Johnson's support from both business leaders and ordinary people. Of course, Johnson's most outstanding move was the 1964 Civil Rights Act. At that time, the Black Civil Rights Movement was in full swing. Slow reform progress had heightened tensions between blacks and whites in many areas, with riots erupting in major cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Chicago. Further delays would have even challenged Martin Luther King Jr.'s ability to maintain peace. Johnson didn't dare delay. He submitted the Civil Rights Bill to Congress and personally lobbied for its passage. Finally, in July 1964, the Civil Rights Act officially took effect. The act abolished segregation and prohibited racial discrimination in hiring by public institutions. It safeguarded basic rights for Black people, making racial discrimination illegal in America. It can be said the 1964 Civil Rights Act was a milestone in the Black civil rights movement. And the passage of the Civil Rights Act elevated Johnson's reputation significantly. Gallup polls showed his approval rating soared to 65%, far ahead of his opponents. Sure enough, Johnson won a landslide victory in the election, securing his place in the White House. Actually, both the Great Society Plan to eliminate poverty and the Civil Rights Act were initiated by Kennedy. But after his assassination, Johnson ended up reaping the benefits. From this perspective, Johnson's presidency was essentially a continuation of Kennedy's era. So when discussing economic growth and living standards, I'll combine the Kennedy and Johnson periods. As mentioned last time, by the mid-1950s, the U.S. economy was already in an absolute leading position. In the 1960s, the economy continued growing, with GNP increasing by $100 billion annually since 1961. What does this mean? It meant America's annual economic growth surpassed all of Europe's. And with rising power, U.S. businesses expanded globally. Post-war U.S. overseas investment was just $12 billion, but surged to $80 billion during Kennedy's presidency. American multinational corporations rose powerfully, becoming behemoths. Take General Motors. Its annual sales equaled 1/3 of West Germany's GNP, truly possessing wealth rivaling nations. Rapid economic growth significantly boosted American incomes, benefiting all social classes. For example, in 1963, America had over 90,000 millionaires, growing by 5,000 annually. America had the world's highest number of millionaires. That same year, blue-collar workers averaged over $400 monthly. Not millionaire wealth, but enough for comfortable living. Overall, 40% of U.S. households earned over $7,000 annually, a level still surpassing many nations today. American lifestyles kept evolving, with TV becoming the primary information medium. For example, after Kennedy's assassination, 75 million people knew about it within half an hour, accounting for 68% of the American population. Um, that evening, the news had spread to every corner of America, and people realized for the first time the power of television media. Um, that in 1964, Kodak invented the point and shoot camera, and Polaroid developed color film. These inventions made photography accessible and brought it into daily life, quickly becoming popular and standard in American households. Interestingly, in the 1980s and 1990s, point and shoot cameras were introduced to China, and many people's understanding of color photos was formed then. In short, during the 1960s, Americans' wealth reached a new level. Although temporarily lagging in the space race, the US surpassed the Soviet Union in terms of people's wealth. Um, but everything in the world has its pros and cons. No one wants to live in poverty. However, excessive material wealth can make people lose their life goals. This is what they call extremes meet. This was the situation young Americans faced in the 1960s. These young people were born after World War II, during the baby boom. Compared to their parents, they didn't experience the Great Depression or war. They grew up in affluence. Their parents might have been happy just by acquiring a radio, a TV, or watching a movie. But for the youth, these things were commonplace. They sought stronger stimulation, and thus the hippie movement emerged. And the English origin of hippie refers to the hip, the part of the body connected to the thigh. The term hippie was originally used to describe opium smokers because when smoking opium, one lies on their side in bed with hips protruding. Coincidentally, hippies often smoked opium or marijuana, so gradually the term became their nickname. Hippies acted in opposition to mainstream American culture. For example, while popular music was soft, hippies listened to heavy rock. Traditional ballroom dancing had slow rhythms, but hippies danced wildly to disco. Americans wore suits and ties, while hippies flaunted eccentric clothes. Traditional views on marriage were monogamous, but hippies formed communes with mixed genders where relationships were unrestricted. So, what exactly were the hippies' beliefs? Let me illustrate using Allen Ginsberg, the spiritual godfather of the hippie movement. Ginsberg was born in 1926. When the hippie movement emerged, he was nearly 40, creating a generation gap with the new wave. He'd already gained fame early, becoming a leader of the American Beat generation through his poem How in 1956. Interestingly, connecting tone, How was also revered as a classic by hippies. What did this poem express? Simply put, Ginsberg harshly criticized the materialistic society. He opposed material worship, rejected societal constraints, championed absolute freedom, and urged people to live by their hearts, all aligning perfectly with hippies' values. Moreover, Ginsberg himself lived wildly and unrestrained. This set an example for hippies to emulate. Thus, Ginsberg became the spokesperson for the hippie movement. Starting in 1965, the hippie movement swept America. Hippies established communes in major cities like New York, Boston, and LA, leveraging American cultural influence. It spread globally to Mexico, Canada, London, Paris, Tokyo, becoming a worldwide phenomenon. In 1967, the hippie movement peaked, but a major turning point came with the Vietnam War. Post-World War II, Vietnam split into North and South regimes. Since North Vietnam was communist-led, America intervened under Cold War logic to contain Soviet influence. Starting with Eisenhower, the U.S. interfered in the Vietnam War, initially providing weapons. By Kennedy's era, they not only sent military advisors but also disliked South Vietnamese President Diem, secretly supporting a coup that led to his assassination. But the new leader, Nguyen Van Thieu, proved more incompetent and corrupt. destabilizing South Vietnam further. When Johnson took office, North Vietnam defeating the South was inevitable. The wise move would have been complete withdrawal. Instead, Johnson did the opposite, deploying ground troops to Vietnam. By September 1965, U.S. troops in Vietnam exceeded 200,000, with costs skyrocketing. Statistics show the Vietnam War cost over $2 billion monthly, burning $27 billion annually, a massive burden on finances. The war profoundly impacted young people's beliefs. On one hand, baby boomers born post-war lived privileged lives with lower war tolerance than previous generations. On the other, modern war's extreme brutality caused shocking trauma, driving many youth against the government. Anti-war hippies, opposing mainstream and coercion, naturally joined. Ginsburg led the charge in anti-Vietnam protests. His influence was immense. Hippies flooded in. Summer 1967 saw them hold a San Francisco concert with nearly 100,000 singing anti-war songs demanding U.S. withdrawal. They coined the famous slogan, "Make love, not war." This summer event became known as the Summer of Love. It marked the merger of hippie and anti-war movements. Facing overwhelming public opinion, Johnson reluctantly agreed to negotiate with North Vietnam, but progress was slow. Meanwhile, U.S. soldier casualties kept mounting back home, fueling greater anti-war waves. Johnson's approval rating hit rock bottom. His popularity vanished, making him America's most disliked president. For example, The Glory and the Dream, completed in 1974, shortly after Johnson left office, the author gave him low marks, calling him a selfish, hypocritical villain. Johnson's poor performance dragged down the entire Democratic Party. In the 1968 election, Republican Nixon defeated the Democratic candidate, becoming the 37th president. Nixon's political journey sounds inspiring. During Eisenhower's term, he served as VP with distinction. In 1959, Nixon narrowly lost to Kennedy in the presidential race. By U.S. political norms, first-time losers rarely recover. Nixon was the exception. After 10 years in exile, he stormed back into the White House. Politically, Nixon staunchly opposed the Soviet Union and communism. Throughout his career, he projected a communism fighter image. But politicians adapt. This same Nixon drastically adjusted U.S. foreign policy. In his first term, he achieved two major feats: complete Vietnam withdrawal and China visit to thaw Sino-U.S. relations. First, Vietnam exit. Nixon's campaign slogan was ending the Vietnam War, but he added a condition: with honor, meaning Nixon would withdraw without humiliating America, especially after losing over 30,000 soldiers. How could the war end honorably? Nixon's approach was negotiating while fighting. In early 1969, during Paris talks between South and North Vietnam, U.S. Secretary Kissinger held secret meetings with North Vietnamese representatives. Meanwhile, Nixon ordered intensified bombing of North Vietnam. Later, Nixon bombed Cambodia, Vietnam's neighbor, to cut supply routes aiding North Vietnam and force their compromise. Over a year, U.S. B-52 bombers conducted over 3,600 raids on Cambodia. Cambodia lay in ruins, unanticipated by Nixon. This triggered fierce domestic backlash. In May 1970, 400-plus U.S. universities suspended classes to protest the war's expansion. Over 100,000 students surrounded the White House in Washington, clashing violently with security. Riots erupted nationwide, destabilizing society. Meanwhile, North Vietnam didn't yield. Instead, anti-war protests showed them U.S. public opinion could end the war, so they halted Paris talks and launched relentless offensives. As expected, U.S. anti-war sentiment surged further. Under immense pressure, Paris talks resumed in early 1973. On January 27th, warring parties signed the Paris Peace Accords. The treaty mandated full U.S. withdrawal from Vietnam within 2 months. North and South Vietnam would then negotiate unification peacefully. Superficially, Nixon achieved his goal, ending the war honorably and saving face. But this was merely self-delusion. After U.S. withdrawal, sober Vietnam collapsed, overthrown by the North in 1975. Ultimately, America lost and paid a heavy price. The Vietnam War was America's longest conflict, lasting 20 years since advisors were sent, costing over $250 billion. Over 650,000 U.S. soldiers served in Vietnam, with nearly 100,000 casualties, second only to World War II. The Vietnam War remains a popular film subject. Top Hollywood directors created classics like Coppola's Apocalypse Now, Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, and Oliver Stone's Platoon. Tom Hanks's Forrest Gump also extensively portrayed the Vietnam War and anti-war movement, showing how deeply it impacted American society. And even today, when Americans discuss Afghanistan or Iraq wars, they still draw comparisons to Vietnam. Now, we've covered Vietnam. Next comes Nixon's other astonishing move, normalizing China-U.S. relations. If Vietnam withdrawal responded to public pressure, China policy showed Nixon taking initiative. Why was he so proactive? This brings us back to U.S.-Soviet rivalry. In the late 1960s, the Soviet Union dramatically expanded its influence while America, stuck in Vietnam, struggled to contain them. Simultaneously, China-Soviet relations froze, with tensions escalating daily. So Nixon sought to ally with China to ease external pressure. China had been blockaded by the U.S.-led Western Bloc since 1949, hampering its economic growth and international exchanges. Given this chance to thaw relations, China was willing to try. But where to start? After careful probing, both sides found a mediator, ping pong. In March 1971, China's ping pong team competed in Nagoya, Japan, their first international appearance in years, signaling openness. And then the U.S. government immediately noticed and quietly allowed American players to interact with the Chinese team. China then formally invited the U.S. team to visit. On April 10, 1971, the U.S. ping pong team arrived in China. The American ping pong team was in China. Later, the Chinese team reciprocated with the U.S. visit. Both sides held exhibition matches. This was the famous ping pong diplomacy, beginning the thaw in Sino-U.S. relations. In July 1971, U.S. Secretary Kissinger secretly visited China to discuss international affairs and bilateral relations. In October, China regained its legitimate seat in the United Nations, marking its return to the international community. This was quickly followed by Nixon's world-shaking visit to China. On February 21, 1972, U.S. President Nixon arrived in Beijing for an official visit to the People's Republic of China. He held talks with Chinese leaders and signed the Shanghai Communique on February 28th. This move marked the normalization of Sino-U.S. relations. Nixon's political career thus reached its peak. In that year's presidential election, he was successfully reelected. Unfortunately, Nixon's joy didn't last long. He soon plummeted like a roller coaster. The Watergate scandal had erupted. Here's how it started. On June 17th, 1972, 5 Republicans broke into Democratic headquarters in Washington to photograph secret documents and install wiretaps, but were caught red-handed due to sloppy work. The Democratic headquarters was in the Watergate building, hence the name. Media exposure caused a sensation, though Nixon was initially unaware. So initially, he promised a thorough investigation. The government established the Watergate Investigation Committee, appointing Cox as special prosecutor. The deeper they dug, the worse it got. Campaign staff, NSC advisors, and top Republicans were implicated. Nixon then changed tactics, trying to cover up the truth, and more troubles piled on. Then Cox discovered Nixon had installed a recording system in the White House to tape his conversations. Cox demanded Nixon hand over the tapes but was refused. Cox persisted relentlessly, so Nixon, humiliated and furious, fired him, escalating the crisis. The public believed Nixon had something to hide. Why else refuse to release the tapes? With near-unanimous criticism, Nixon's position grew increasingly precarious. By July 1974, the Supreme Court intervened, ruling Nixon must surrender the tapes. Cornered but stubborn, Nixon prepared for desperate resistance. At a staff meeting, he proposed deploying the 82nd Airborne Division to guard the White House, an unprecedented move. Kissinger then said, "You cannot be president from a White House surrounded by bayonets." Nixon fell silent and abandoned the military plan. On August 8th, Nixon finally couldn't hold on and announced his resignation, becoming the only U.S. president to resign over a scandal so far. It should be noted that The Glory and the Dream sets its time limit at 1972. And when this book was written, Nixon hadn't resigned yet. The author, William Manchester, didn't know the outcome. So in his view, America's future seemed kind of bleak. Hard to say if it'd get better or worse. With this, we've covered all the content of The Glory and the Dream. Through these 4 volumes, I bet you've got a full and deep understanding of America's history from 1932 to 1972. At the same time, you formed your own views on how America rose from a failed nation in the Great Depression to a superpower. So as a summary of the whole book, let me talk about how important The Glory and the Dream really is. Simply put, it's the best read for understanding American history and its rise. The Glory and the Dream was published in 1974 and caused a big splash right away, making William Manchester super famous. Mainstream U.S. media like the New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal gave it high praise, calling it a great popular history work. As you'd expect, The Glory and the Dream became a regular on bestseller lists and a must-read for Americans at the time. After that, it settled firmly on global bestseller lists. For over 40 years, it's been translated into 17 languages like Chinese, French, and Russian, even a Braille edition, becoming a key to understanding modern America. The Glory and the Dream was translated into Chinese in 1978. Back then, China had just opened up, and this book was like a window, opening Chinese readers' eyes wide. The book's storytelling style deeply influenced readers back then. Manchester just tells tales throughout, weaving through big events like the Great Depression, Roosevelt's New Deal, World War II, and the Cold War, rarely jumping in with opinions or preaching. Of course, this doesn't mean the author's got no stance. His way is detailed, laying out the whole story, good and bad, for readers to judge themselves. For instance, the book starts with U.S. war vets gathering in Washington, demanding government compensation, only to face a crackdown that led to bloody clashes. In his narrative, the author avoids direct criticism, instead highlighting the veterans' humble status and hardships to starkly contrast with the U.S. government's arrogance, bullying, and broken promises. This sharp contrast naturally leads readers to understand which side deserves condemnation. Another example, the author most admired Presidents Roosevelt and Kennedy, yet he doesn't deify them. Instead, he details their policies and personal charisma. Even considering Roosevelt and Kennedy's greatness, what actual impact did they have on America? But simultaneously, the author doesn't conceal their mistakes, some insights even gaining support from later mainstream researchers. For instance, Roosevelt's expansion of presidential power created hidden risks for U.S. checks and balances. Kennedy's blind investment in the space race defeated the Soviets but brought little tangible benefit to America. These critiques, especially of Kennedy, were truly pioneering in historical discourse. This narrative style felt revolutionary to Chinese readers in the 1980s to 90s. Its departure from idolizing historical figures and black and white political narratives made The Glory and the Dream an instant sensation among intellectuals. It can be said that a generation of Chinese journalists and historians emulated this book when documenting China's past and present. And historians like Ji Yangshang, Fudan University, and philosophy professor He Huihong, Peking University, have lavished praise on The Glory and the Dream. Entrepreneurs like Donald Trump and Yumin Hong were also deeply captivated by this book. In this sense, The Glory and the Dream not only chronicles U.S. history, but profoundly resonates in the Chinese psyche. All right, we've now fully covered the great work, The Glory and the Dream, and keynotes are below the audio. See you tomorrow.